In the stillness of a medieval winter evening, when daylight slipped away early and the cold wrapped tightly around wooden beams and stone walls, the world of the Middle Ages was illuminated not by bright electric bulbs, but by the gentle flicker of candlelight. Yet candles in those times were not only a source of light, but also a strange, sometimes desperate sustenance. Most were made from tallow, the rendered fat of cattle or sheep, which gave them a pungent, smoky odour when lit, filling the air with a heaviness that clung to hair and clothes. For the wealthy, beeswax candles burned more cleanly, releasing a faint honeyed sweetness into chapels and noble halls. The difference between tallow and wax was not only in fragrance but in meaning. Wax was a mark of privilege, signalling that one lived above the earthy stench of ordinary life. But hunger knows little of privilege, and so stories survive of poor souls gnawing on tallow candles, chewing their greasy substance when bread was scarce, when famine swept through fields, or when war left granaries bare. One can almost picture a village huddled in darkness, the hearth already extinguished by the curfew bell, the children restless from the ache of empty stomachs. A mother, unable to bear their cries, would take a candle stub from its holder, break it into pieces, and place it in small hands as if it were a crust of bread. The children chewed the waxy fat, their lips slick, their faces shadowed in the dim flame of another stub still burning nearby. Though such an act seems unthinkable today, in a time when food preservation was poor and winters could be brutal, a candle was not just light, it was calories, crude and oily, but calories all the same. Chronicles and sermons whispered disapproval, equating such acts with desperation bordering on sin, for a candle was meant to honor God by pushing back darkness, not to be consumed like a loaf. Still, necessity bends rules, and the habit persisted in corners where hunger gnawed louder than conscience. Beyond eating, candles were also symbols of devotion and tools of measurement. Monks in abbeys, their lives bound to the rhythm of prayer, often measured time by candles, marking lines along the wax and watching them melt hour by hour. For them, the burning candle became a living clock, each drip of tallow or wax bringing them closer to the next psalm. In contrast, villagers used candles more sparingly, for each stick represented labour, the slaughter of beasts, the boiling of fat, the moulding in wooden forms. Light was precious, and so nights were darker than one might imagine, with many households choosing to sit in near darkness rather than waste a candle. When used, they often carried dual purpose, sometimes lit briefly to guide a hand to the bed, then snuffed and saved, the wick blackened but preserved for another night. Yet the strangeness of the candle in medieval life did not end there. In times of superstition, bits of wax were shaved and swallowed as charms, believed to cure ailments of the chest or stomach. In taverns, where merriment pushed aside piety, pranksters dared one another to swallow burning wax drops or to let hot drippings fall onto their tongues, laughter mingling with pain and smoke. Some even believed that a candle extinguished suddenly, leaving behind a thin ribbon of smoke, carried omens of death within a household, a warning that the flame of life could be snuffed just as quickly. Thus, to eat a candle was not merely hunger's madness, it was also to invite whispers of ill fortune, to consume a substance meant for both light and spirit. For nobles and kings, the candle became theatre. In great banquets, hallways would glow with hundreds of beeswax tapers, their golden flames transforming stone into something almost heavenly, the glow reflected in silver platters, in jeweled goblets, in the polished armor of guards lining the walls. Here, no one ate the candles, there was no need. Instead, they burned them extravagantly, a sign of wealth displayed in flame and honey-scented air. Guests would watch the wax bend and glisten, droplets falling like tears, until they pooled and hardened on the wooden tables below. Servants scraped them later, remoulding scraps into lesser candles for kitchens and quarters, a cycle that revealed how even luxury bled down into utility. But outside of banquets and chapels, the ordinary man saw candles differently. He saw them as an object of thrift, broken into smaller pieces, carried from room to room. He saw them as a source of faint heat when pressed close to the hands. And sometimes, when famine pressed too hard, he saw them as food, meagre, greasy, bitter food. That act, strange as it seems to us, was a testament to both the desperation and resilience of people who lived under constant threat of hunger. In their world, a candle was at once a luxury, a necessity, and in the darkest hours, a substitute for bread. Its light cast not only shadows on the wall but reflections of the strange choices survival demanded. And as the flame burned low, it reminded them that in the fragile line between light and darkness, hunger and sustenance, even a simple candle could take on many lives. In the rhythm of medieval life, bread was far more than food. It was the foundation of meals, the symbol of God's provision, the very measure of survival. But beyond nourishment, bread served another peculiar purpose. It was a vessel, a plate, a humble substitute for the dishes most households did not own. In taverns, castles, and peasant cottages alike, the table was often set with thick slabs of coarse bread, known as trenchers. These were not delicate loaves baked for taste, but dense, sturdy hunks cut flat on top, their rough texture ready to catch the juices of roasted meats, stews, and gravies. When the feast began, food was piled directly onto them, meat juices soaked into the bread, mixing with bits of vegetables and fat, until the trencher became soft and heavy with flavor. By the meal's end, the bread was no longer just bread, it was a vessel transformed, infused with the essence of everything it had held. For the poor, trenchers were eaten by those who used them, every last softened crumb swallowed hungrily, as nothing could be wasted. But for the wealthy, the story was different. At noble feasts, the rich often left their soaked trenchers uneaten, pushing them aside with barely a glance. These greasy, gravy-soaked slabs were then collected by servants, carried away not to the refuse heap, but to the poor who waited outside. There, the hungry would clutch the leftovers of lords, consuming the flavors of feasts they themselves could never enter. In this way, trenchers formed a strange bridge between classes, a nobleman's table scraps becoming a peasant's rare banquet. The bread bore silent witness to both the splendor and inequality of the medieval world. The practice itself revealed much about the scarcity of resources. Plates of wood or pewter existed, but for most people, such objects were rare luxuries. Why carve and maintain wooden plates when bread could serve the same function and also be eaten afterward? The simplicity of trenchers made them essential for banquets, where dozens or even hundreds of guests gathered. Imagine the long trestle tables of a great hall, lit by candles, where knights, nobles, and ladies laughed and spoke over meats and fish, while before each of them lay a trencher, waiting to absorb the bounty. When the feasting was done, these sodden loaves marked the passage of plenty to hunger, moving from hand to hand, class to class, until nothing remained but crumbs scattered on the floor for the dogs. Yet trenchers were not always made of edible bread. Some were baked specifically to be too hard, crafted from stale loaves intentionally dried until they resembled blocks of wood. These were durable enough to last several meals before being discarded. In other cases, trenchers were hollowed-out loaves, their centers scooped away so that stews could be poured inside, making bread a bowl as well as a plate. The boundaries between vessel and food blurred. What began as a dish ended as a course, a meal merging practicality with survival. In monasteries, where frugality and ritual intertwined, monks too ate from trenchers, though their meals were plainer, the bread often dark, heavy with rye or barley. Still, the act carried the same symbolic weight, food resting upon food, sustenance layered upon sustenance. One can imagine the sensory world of a medieval meal, the sound of knives scraping against bread instead of ceramic, the sight of gravy running down crust into cracks, the smell of roasted meat mingling with yeast and ash from the ovens. To eat in such a world was not merely to consume, but to participate in a cycle where nothing was wasted. Even when trenchers were discarded after meals, they often ended up in the troughs of animals, pigs rooting eagerly through the softened slabs. Thus, the bread lived a life beyond its baking, a journey from oven to table, from lord's feast to beggar's hand, from scraps to fodder. And beneath this practice lay a deeper meaning. Bread had always been sacred, tied to prayers and blessings, to the belief that every loaf was a gift from God. Using it as a plate blurred the line between the holy and the mundane, between respect for the loaf and the simple necessity of survival. In some corners, priests frowned at the habit, warning that bread should be honored, not used as a tool. Yet the habit persisted across centuries, proof that in the Middle Ages, practicality often triumphed over ceremony. So the trencher, plain and heavy, tells us a story. It tells of hunger and ingenuity, of feasts and scraps, of how the same loaf could serve both noble and beggar. It reminds us that medieval life was shaped not by abundance but by the careful use of what was at hand. Bread was not only sustenance, but dish, plate, bowl, and gift. In its quiet role, it revealed the resilience of a world that survived by turning even the simplest food into something endlessly useful, endlessly shared. Softness, in the medieval mind, often carried with it the shadow of sin. To sink into comfort was to risk sinking into temptation, for the world of faith and penance prized austerity over indulgence. Among the many strange customs of the Middle Ages, one that startles the modern sleeper is the suspicion and even outright rejection of pillows. To many reformers and monks, pillows were not harmless accessories of rest, but dangerous invitations to idleness and weakness of spirit. In a world where the bed itself was often nothing more than a rough pallet stuffed with straw, the idea of cradling one's head on a cushion seemed to verge on luxury, a softness that dulled the edge of devotion. Within monasteries, where every act was scrutinized under the light of spiritual discipline, pillows were sometimes banned altogether. The rule of St. Benedict, which shaped monastic life across Europe, emphasized humility, simplicity, and the avoidance of bodily comfort. For monks striving to remain vigilant even in their sleep, laying the head on a pillow was thought to pamper the flesh, to grant it pleasure when the spirit ought to rule. Instead, some monks rested their heads directly on wooden boards or used rolled-up cloaks, their sleep deliberately made harder so that they might rise more swiftly for prayer when the bell tolled in the dead of night. Hardness was virtue, and every denial of comfort was another step toward purity. The suspicion of pillows spread beyond cloisters. Among moralists and preachers, there were warnings that too much comfort in bed led not only to sloth but to sin of the flesh. To rest the head too easily was to risk the wandering of dreams, to open the body to temptation in the privacy of night. Parents warned their children against softness, teaching them to sleep with little more than their clothes as cover, their heads resting on bare wood or bundled garments. Even kings, despite their access to feather-stuffed finery, were often reminded by confessors that to lie on plump cushions was to flirt with vanity and excess. Yet not everyone abided by such severity. Wealthy households across Europe embraced pillows, especially as trade routes brought exotic fabrics and stuffing materials. Down feathers, imported silks, and dyed linens turned pillows into objects of beauty and pride. In the bedchambers of nobles, where great canopies draped overhead and furs warmed the body against the cold, pillows became symbols of refinement. Their presence told visitors that here dwelled not mere peasants, but lords and ladies, whose wealth could buy even softness for the head. Such pillows, embroidered with coats of arms or stitched with gold thread, were never hidden. They were displayed like jewels of the chamber, visible proof of a household station. The contrast between cloister and castle was striking. Where monks rejected pillows as sinful, nobles flaunted them as status. Where reformers preached hardness as salvation, merchants bought pillows dyed in exotic hues to impress guests. And in between, the ordinary folk made do with makeshift supports, sacks stuffed with chaff, bundles of hay, or folded cloaks. These substitutes were not indulgences but necessities, born of practicality rather than desire for comfort. Yet even here, suspicion lingered, for to sleep too softly was still whispered to be a danger, and the tales of holy men who lay their heads on stones were told as examples to imitate. One can imagine the hush of a monastic dormitory at midnight. Dozens of monks lie on straw-filled mattresses, their heads resting on the hardness of the floorboards or on nothing at all, bodies trained to deny what instinct demands. Outside the abbey walls, in the chamber of a merchant's wife, embroidered pillows are arranged carefully on a bed, their covers smelling faintly of lavender, their softness promising a sleep more luxurious than most could dream. Between these two worlds stretched the strange medieval relationship with comfort, both feared and desired, condemned and coveted. Even in literature, pillows carried symbolic weight. To dream upon a pillow was to risk being deceived by visions, for dreams were often seen as doors through which devils might whisper. A hard bed, without cushion, was thought to keep the mind sharper, the dreams purer, the body less likely to fall prey to nocturnal weakness. Thus, the rejection of pillows was not merely practical, but spiritual, a statement of resistance against indulgence and temptation, even in the most private hours of rest. And yet, despite sermons and bans, pillows never vanished from medieval life. They survived in quiet corners, in noble halls, in the secret indulgence of those who could not resist softness. For all the suspicion cast upon them, pillows revealed a truth about the human spirit in the Middle Ages, that even in an age of hardship and austerity, the longing for comfort endured. Whether forbidden or flaunted, pillows stood as silent witnesses to the medieval struggle between denial and desire, between the call of discipline and the pull of the flesh. To rest one's head upon one was at once a simple act and a quiet rebellion, a reminder that even in centuries of stern faith, the body's craving for softness could not be fully banished. When darkness fell over medieval Europe, the night was not an endless expanse of obscurity. It was measured, interpreted, and divided by the sky above. In the absence of mechanical clocks, which were rare and often unreliable, the people of the Middle Ages turned their eyes upward, reading the heavens as one might read a book. Monks, shepherds, sailors, and travellers alike measured the passing of time by the slow drift of constellations, the rising of stars at the horizon, and the movement of the moon through its pale course. To them, the night was not silent. It ticked forward in celestial rhythm, and those who kept vigil knew its language well. In monasteries, where the day was governed by prayer, night was also carefully divided. The monks' hours, matins, lauds, and prime were announced not by bells alone, but by the watching of the sky. A brother assigned to night watch would stand beneath the cloister's arches, scanning the heavens for familiar stars. When certain constellations tilted toward the west, he would know it was time to summon the others from their straw pallets. In silence, he walked through the dormitory, touching shoulders, whispering softly, until the monks rose like shadows and gathered in the chapel. There, by candlelight, they chanted psalms while outside. Orion's belt marched slowly onward, a cosmic clock above their bowed heads. For common folk, who lacked such strict ritual, stars still played a role in structuring the night. Farmers knew that certain stars signaled the changing seasons, and they carried that knowledge into the rhythm of planting and harvesting. Sailors upon the darkened seas fixed their gaze on the North Star, using it not only to guide their ships but to count the hours until dawn. Travellers along lonely roads timed their journeys by the moon's position, resting when it dipped below treetops, moving when it climbed higher into the sky. Time was fluid, less precise than the tick of a clock, but no less dependable. The stars also entered the fabric of stories and superstitions. To look upon them too long was said to bring visions, for many believed the stars carried influence over human fate. Astrologers studied their courses, drawing charts that tied the destinies of kings and peasants alike to the heavens. Yet beyond fate, the stars were practical guides, luminous markers against the vast darkness. A mother might comfort a restless child by pointing to the sky, saying, "When that bright star reaches the roof's edge, morning will not be far." In this way, the heavens became the people's companion, speaking to them in glimmers of light. Still, the night was not simply divided for usefulness. It was also a stage for reverence. Monks measured their vigils not by hours but by constellations, their voices rising in chant as the stars slowly shifted. In many villages, festivals honored the solstices and equinoxes, when the stars and sun aligned to mark the turning of seasons. These nights were filled with firelight, dancing, and song. Yet beneath the celebration was always the same awareness that the heavens were timekeepers, silent yet steadfast. And in the quiet solitude of the countryside, one might imagine a lone shepherd tending his flock beneath the velvet sky. He counts the hours by the steady climb of the Pleiades, his staff resting in his hand, his breath a cloud in the cold air. Around him, sheep shift and murmur, but his gaze remains fixed upward. Each familiar star reassures him that time is moving, that the world is turning, that morning will come. For in the Middle Ages, night was never truly still. It was alive with the slow dance of the cosmos, a clock written in light that needed no gears, no pendulum, only eyes to see it and hearts patient enough to wait. Thus, the night divided by stars was more than a measure of time. It was a reminder of connection between heaven and earth, between the divine and the mortal. Every flickering star became a marker of order in a world often uncertain, guiding both prayer and labor, anchoring human life to something eternal. And as dawn crept at last over the horizon, the stars faded one by one, their task complete until night returned, and once more the heavens resumed their quiet keeping of time. There was a time, not long after Rome's decline, when the echoes of marble bathhouses still lingered across Europe. Warm pools, steaming chambers, and flowing fountains had once been open to citizens, a daily rhythm of cleansing that mingled health with sociability. But as centuries passed into what we call the Middle Ages, this Roman legacy dimmed, until bathing became less a mark of refinement and more a source of suspicion. For many in the medieval world, water was not a friend but a danger, a substance thought to open the body to illness. What had once been considered a ritual of health became, by curious turns of belief and circumstance, something viewed with doubt, avoidance, and even fear. In the early centuries, public bathhouses survived, especially in cities where Roman influence lingered. Men and women entered separately or at different hours, soaking in heated pools, scrubbing with cloth and sand, gossiping as steam filled the air. The poor could find relief in these places, paying small coins for entry, while nobles sometimes built private baths within their manors. Cleanliness was still seen as both hygienic and spiritual. Many monasteries kept modest bathing rooms, for purity was tied to the care of the body as well as the soul. Yet gradually, suspicions grew. By the 12th century, whispers spread that the warmth of baths weakened the body's defenses, opening the pores so that sickness might slip inside. Physicians warned against frequent bathing, believing it unbalanced the humors, those delicate fluids thought to govern health. What had once been a practice of healing began to wear the mask of harm. The change was not sudden but crept through generations. When plague and sickness ravaged Europe, people noted how swiftly disease traveled through crowded cities, and baths, once places of healing, became suspect as breeding grounds for corruption. The Black Death deepened this suspicion, for many believed steam and water carried contagion. To immerse oneself in a bathhouse was to risk death, and so doors closed, tiles cracked, and fountains ran dry. Those who still bathed often did so rarely, perhaps once or twice a year, choosing instead to cleanse by wiping themselves with cloths dipped in vinegar or herbs. Cleanliness was redefined not as washing in water, but as changing into fresh linen, the fabric thought to absorb sweat and impurities from the skin. To don a clean shirt was considered almost as effective as a bath, and far less dangerous. Yet the truth was never uniform. In certain towns, bathhouses survived longer, particularly where trade routes brought prosperity. There, merchants and travellers soaked away the dust of journeys, sometimes even mingling in places that were as much houses of pleasure as of cleansing. Authorities often frowned upon these associations, for bathhouses could quickly become sites of vice, where physical relaxation blurred into moral indulgence. Preachers railed from pulpits, warning that hot baths softened both the body and the will, tempting one towards sins of the flesh. So, bathing fell under suspicion from both physicians and priests, a practice, once central, now shadowed with warning. Still, water retained its sacred role. Pilgrims sought holy springs, believed to cure ailments, and the ritual of baptism remained unshaken, a plunge into cleansing water that washed away sin itself. The contradiction was stark. The same culture that shunned regular bathing still revered water as the channel of divine grace. In monasteries, the balance was careful. Brothers bathed rarely, sometimes only a few times a year, yet they washed their hands and faces before prayers, small ablutions that reminded them of purity, without indulging in comfort. One might picture a noble household in winter, its halls filled with smoke and the smell of wool and furs. Servants carry basins of warm water for their lord, who washes his face and hands, while the rest of his body remains untouched for months. Perhaps in spring, when the weather softens, a wooden tub is filled in the courtyard, lined with cloth, and heated stones dropped into its depths. Children laugh as steam rises, but their elders watch with caution, aware of the danger said to lurk in pores open too long. In contrast, far away, in lands touched more directly by Islamic influence, the hammam thrives, its marble baths echoing with voices, its chambers perfumed with oils. The divide is telling. In one world, water is life and healing. In another, it is danger and risk. Thus, the story of medieval bathing is not one of complete abandonment, but of transformation. From marble pools to wooden tubs, from daily soaks to yearly immersions, the practice shifted as fears and beliefs reshaped it. To us, it seems strange to shun what we consider health. Yet for them, it was reasoned caution, a way to survive in a world where illness struck without mercy. The bath, once a symbol of civilization, became instead a rare event, sometimes celebratory, sometimes fearful. And in the dim light of a medieval chamber, where linen hung freshly laundered, a man might rest easy not because his body was washed, but because his shirt was clean, and in that belief he thought himself safe. When the sun sank beyond the fields and the hearth's glow dimmed, the medieval home became a place not of solitude, but of mingled life. For in the cottages of peasants, and even in the halls of lesser nobles, the line between human dwelling and animal shelter was blurred. Cows, goats, chickens, and sometimes even pigs were part of the household, not distant creatures kept apart in barns, but companions of necessity who shared warmth, space, and breath. The walls of a medieval hut were thin, the thatch roof draughty, and the winters long and punishing. To sleep through the cold demanded every scrap of heat, and so families drew their livestock inside at night, letting the animals settle on the earthen floor beside them. In that mingling of human and beast, survival was stitched together by warmth, odour, and the sound of breath. A traveller peering into such a dwelling might have been startled. A mother stirred porridge at the hearth while hens clucked softly in the corner, scratching at straw scattered on the ground. Children played with piglets, their laughter mixing with squeals, while a goat nudged its head toward a wooden trough. At night, when family and beasts alike lay down, the room became a chorus of snoring, lowing, and rustling. The human body, wrapped in wool or coarse linen, rested inches from the hide of a cow or the bristly back of a hog. It was a scene far removed from the separation of species we know today, yet for them it was simply life, practical and necessary. This arrangement was not only about warmth. Animals were wealth, and to keep them close was to guard them against theft. A cow meant milk for the children, a pig promised meat for winter, a hen offered eggs each dawn. To leave them outside in frail pens was to risk losing them to wolves, to thieves, or to the hunger of harsher nights. Better to hear the steady chewing of a cow while lying on straw than to rise in the morning to find it gone. In this way, the medieval bedroom became a treasury, its inhabitants pressed together in a kind of mutual protection. But such proximity came with its peculiarities. The smell was heavy, thick with dung and sweat, clinging to clothes and hair. Vermin thrived, scuttling between humans and animals alike, while fleas and lice paid no heed to the difference between child and goat. Physicians of the time sometimes warned of the dangers of breathing the same air as beasts, yet necessity often outweighed such cautions. And perhaps, in their way, families grew accustomed, finding comfort in the noises of their livestock. The low murmur of a cow in the night might soothe a restless child, as familiar as the voice of a sibling. Even in wealthier homes, animals often found their way into the chambers of humans. Dogs, long companions of the hunt and the hearth, slept at their masters' feet, warming beds with their bodies. Cats roamed freely, guardians against rats and mice that threatened grain stores. In castles, falcons were sometimes brought indoors, tethered in chambers or halls, symbols of prestige as well as hunters awaiting the next flight. Yet it was in the cottages of the poor that the mingling was most complete, where livestock were family by necessity, their presence woven into the rhythm of daily life. Literature of the time occasionally mocked or marvelled at this intimacy. Tales told of peasants so poor that their bed was shared not only with children but with a sow and her litter, snuffling against the straw. Travellers from afar, particularly those from lands where houses were built differently, wrote with surprise of English or German peasants who lived as though their animals were kin. But for those within the culture, there was little shame. It was practicality, and it kept life going. One can imagine a winter's night in such a hut. The wind howls against the thatch, snow presses at the door, and the fire dwindles to embers. A family curls together on their pallet, children pressed against parents, a pig shifting near their feet, a goat's body warm against the side of the bed. The air is thick, pungent, yet filled with life. Outside, the world is hostile and cold, but within, the mingling of human and animal forms a strange cocoon of survival. In that mingling lay a truth of the Middle Ages, that the boundaries between man and beast were thinner than we imagine, their lives entwined not by choice, but by the constant negotiation with hunger, cold, and fear. Thus the animals in the medieval bedroom remind us of a world both harsh and intimate, where necessity silenced notions of cleanliness and order. They reveal a life in which survival erased the luxury of distance, where warmth and protection mattered more than separation. And in that strange companionship, the household was not merely human, but a living community of flesh, fur, feather, and hope, pressed close together in the dark. In the dim and cluttered corners of a medieval apothecary's shop, shelves groaned with jars of powders, vials of oils, and bundles of dried plants tied with twine. The air was a mingling of scents, sharp vinegar, sweet lavender, pungent garlic, and the earthy musk of roots dug from damp soil. This was the place people came when illness took hold, when fever burned, when wounds festered, when breath rattled in the chest. Yet what awaited them was not always the soothing balm of knowledge as we understand it, but a strange collection of cures born of equal parts tradition, superstition, and trial. Here, in these shelves, one might find not only herbs and honey, but crushed emeralds, roasted hedgehog, and even fragments of human bone, each promised to carry some hidden virtue against sickness. The worldview of medicine in the Middle Ages was built upon the balance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to come from their imbalance, and the apothecary's task was to restore harmony. To cool a fever, one might be given a syrup of violets mixed with vinegar, meant to soothe the fiery humour of yellow bile. To rouse the sluggish body, spiced wine laced with ginger or pepper might be prescribed, heating the cold phlegm into motion. These remedies were not without sense, for herbs and spices did hold properties we now recognise. Yet, alongside them lay far stranger prescriptions, ones that blurred the line between medicine and magic. Consider powdered emerald, believed to heal the stomach and ward off poison. Ground painstakingly with mortar and pestle, the gem's shimmering dust was mixed into wine or sprinkled upon food, swallowed at great cost by those who could afford it. Crushed pearls were thought to calm the heart, while powdered gold promised vigour and strength. These were not medicines of the poor, but luxuries for nobles who could turn wealth itself into a remedy. Yet even the humblest cures held oddity. Earthworms roasted and dried were crumbled into powder and taken for fever. A poultice of cow dung was pressed against wounds to draw out infection. Snail slime was smeared upon skin inflamed with burns. The apothecary's art was also bound to belief in sympathetic magic, the idea that cured. For madness, a patient might be given a drink brewed from the skull of a man who had died violently, the belief being that the spirit of energy within the bone might steady the mind. For epilepsy, blood from a freshly killed animal was sometimes prescribed, drunk while still warm. Strange as these cures seem to us, they were not considered grotesque then, but earnest attempts to wrestle with sickness in a world where death hovered close. Animals, too, were drawn into the realm of medicine. The fat of a bear was melted into salves for aching joints, while the ashes of a hedgehog, burned whole, were said to relieve bladder stones. Dog's milk was thought to soften a harsh cough, and owl's eggs, roasted and crushed, promised to sharpen failing sight. Even urine found its place, both as a diagnostic tool examined for colour, clarity, and scent, and as a component of remedies, mixed into tonics or applied to wounds. The boundaries of disgust were thinner in those centuries, and necessity taught people to use what they had, however unlikely. And yet, for all their strangeness, some remedies carried wisdom we recognise today. Honey, used to coat wounds, indeed fights infection. Garlic, taken for coughs, held antibacterial properties. Willow bark, chewed for pain, contained the precursor to aspirin. The apothecary's shelves were thus a mingling of true medicine and superstition, science hidden beneath layers of myth. For the sufferer who entered that dark shop, hope was found not in certainty, but in the sheer variety of cures offered, each one a chance, however slim, to turn sickness aside. Picture a village at dusk. A mother carries her fevered child into the apothecary, her face drawn with worry. The apothecary, his hands stained with herbs, offers her a vial of syrup honey mixed with crushed herbs and whispers instructions. He also presses into her hand a charm, a scrap of parchment inked with a prayer, for words themselves were thought to carry healing power. She leaves with both remedy and blessing, comforted less by knowledge than by the sense that something has been done. In this way, medicine in the Middle Ages was not only a science but a ritual, a way of pushing back despair with powders, prayers, and faith. Thus the strange cures of the apothecary reveal a world grappling with mystery, a world where sickness seemed both natural and supernatural, where every object held potential power, from jewels crushed to dust to animals burned to ash, from herbs steeped in wine to charms whispered over wounds. The remedies of the Middle Ages remind us of a time when the boundaries between health, faith, and superstition blurred. To step into that shop was to step into a realm of hope wrapped in oddity, where the strange and the sacred mingled on the shelves, each jar a fragile promise against the ever-present shadow of death. As twilight deepened over medieval towns, a solemn sound often rolled across rooftops, and through narrow lanes the tolling of the curfew bell. To us, the word may carry the weight of restrictions or military orders, but in the Middle Ages, the curfew was a nightly command rooted in both safety and ritual. When the bell rang from a church tower or civic hall, its message was clear. Fires must be covered, lamps extinguished, and households hushed into stillness. The name itself came from the old French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire, a reminder that flames, if left unattended, could devour a city built of timber and thatch. With a single toll, entire communities moved as one, snuffing out sparks, pressing embers beneath ash, and surrendering the night to darkness. The sound of the bell was more than a warning, it was the heartbeat of evening life. In villages, children paused their play in the dirt streets, farmers set down their tools, and women hurried to finish tasks by the hearth. The bell's voice, heavy and resonant, echoed across fields and rivers, a signal even to those working late beyond the walls. Within moments, smoke that had risen in thin trails from 100 chimneys began to thin, and silence replaced the clatter of daily labor. The streets emptied, shutters were drawn, and doors barred. Where just before there had been the hum of life, now only the muffled lowing of cattle or the distant bark of a dog broke the hush. In towns of stone and timber, the curfew bell was a safeguard against catastrophe. Fires were the greatest threat to medieval settlements, where one spark could leap from roof to roof and consume entire quarters in hours. Wooden beams, thatch, and straw-filled mattresses made tinder of every home, so the bell was law as well as ritual, enforced by watchmen who patrolled the streets, ensuring no flame glowed where it should not. Those caught defying curfew could be fined, their candles seized, their reputations marked with carelessness. The bell thus represented authority, its toll binding each person to the collective duty of safety. Yet beyond practicality, the bell shaped the rhythm of night. Once its sound faded, life retreated indoors. Families gathered around the dim light of a single candle, whispering prayers, telling stories, or drifting into sleep. Outside, darkness reigned more completely than we can imagine today. With fires covered and lamps extinguished, streets lay in shadows so deep that only the stars and moon gave guidance. To walk abroad after curfew was to move through a world of silence, where each footfall echoed and each shadow seemed alive. Watchmen carried lanterns, their pools of light small against the great sweep of dark. For those abroad, the bell's earlier toll lingered in memory, a warning that the night belonged not to men, but to stillness. Still, the curfew bell was not heard in every land alike. In some villages, its ringing was rare, reserved for times of danger, while in others, it was nightly, so regular that its sound became woven into the fabric of existence. Children grew up measuring their evenings by its toll, lovers parted at its sound, Merchants shuttered their shops at its command. For many, it marked not only safety but also the sacred transition between day and night, labor and rest. In monasteries, where bells already governed the hours, the curfew blended seamlessly with the rhythm of prayer, signaling that even the town outside must now fall into ordered silence. Imagine the scene: a bustling market square at dusk, stalls heavy with wares, voices rising in trade. Then the deep bell tolls. Slowly voices falter, merchants pack their goods, shutters close, the square empties, shadows stretch. The same sound rolls over farmsteads beyond the walls, where mothers call children indoors, where shepherds lead flocks into pens. Across all, the bell gathers life into silence, pressing the world into the embrace of night. To the medieval mind, the curfew bell was thus both guardian and tyrant, an assurance of safety and a command of restraint. Its voice was weighty, unavoidable, and yet strangely comforting. For when the bell tolled, one knew that neighbors were also covering their fires, that the entire community moved together into darkness. The silence that followed was not only the absence of flame but the presence of unity, a shared trust that life would rise again with dawn. And so the sound of the curfew bell reminds us of a world where each night carried danger, where fire could mean ruin, and where safety was found not in isolation but in the shared obedience to a single, resonant call. In the world of the Middle Ages, even the colors you wore could betray your place in the order of things. Clothing was never simply fabric to cover the body. It was a marker of class, wealth, and worth. Sumptuary laws, strict regulations decreed by kings, councils, or city officials governed what fabrics and hues each rank of society might claim. Rich dyes, imported silks, and certain adornments were not for all, but reserved for those of status. To wear what was forbidden was to step beyond one's station, to dress in a lie that challenged the fragile balance of hierarchy. Thus, color itself became a language, and the violation of its grammar could bring fines, humiliation, or worse. The rarest and most coveted of all hues was deep purple, once born of shells from distant coasts, so costly that a few drops could be worth more than gold. In the Middle Ages, this royal purple was guarded fiercely, permitted only to kings, emperors, or the highest nobles. Scarlet, too, carried restriction, its bright brilliance achieved by grinding the dried bodies of insects imported from lands far away. To walk through the market square in such a shade, unless you were of privilege, was to invite scorn or punishment. Blue, though more common, held its own symbolism when dyed with costly indigo, while green and yellow were often considered humble, their dyes easier to obtain from plants. Laws spread through kingdoms like invisible threads. In England, the statutes of apparel declared that only the highest ranks might wear ermine, the white fur of winter stoats, or garments lined with velvet. In Italy and France, city councils forbade merchants' wives from dressing in silks, lest they rival the nobility in splendor. Even within the church, rules dictated the colors of vestments, each shade tied to ritual seasons. The purpose was clear. Clothing was to reflect the divine order, reminding all who saw it of where one stood in the ladder of society. Yet, such rules revealed as much defiance as obedience. Merchants, rising in wealth but not in rank, often sought to display their success in the colors of their garments. They hired tailors to dye their wool in brighter hues, or purchased second-hand silks smuggled through markets. Women braided gold thread into their sleeves, or lined their hoods with furs too fine for their station. Officials patrolled the streets, fining those whose clothing betrayed ambition. Yet the struggle was endless, for pride and vanity proved stronger than regulation. To dress above one's class was to taste, even briefly, the power and respect that clothing commanded. The fascination with color also held spiritual weight. Black, somber, and plain was often linked to humility and the church. Yet when dyed deeply and richly, it became a mark of sophistication among nobles who prized its elegance. Red carried both the heat of passion and the blood of Christ, making it both feared and revered. Green was tied to fertility, yellow to betrayal, grey to poverty. A medieval man or woman walking through a crowded street was therefore more than simply dressed. They were a living text, their garments telling others who they were, what they possessed, and what was permitted to them. Consider a feast in a noble hall. Lords clad in scarlet cloaks trimmed with ermine, ladies draped in gowns of blue silk embroidered with silver. Servants pass among them, their tunics plain, their colours muted, their fabrics rough. Among them slips a merchant, newly prosperous, daring in a tunic dyed too boldly, his sleeves lined with squirrel fur forbidden to his kind. He enjoys the warmth of the hall, the music of lutes, but feels eyes upon him. He knows that with a word, the steward might fine him, strip him of his pretense, yet still he lingers in defiance, wrapped in colours that proclaim not only wealth but desire to rise. And in the villages, where sumptuary laws rarely reached, the poor clothed themselves in what they could: brown wool, undyed linen, rough cloaks patched and repatched. To them, the forbidden colours were not temptations but distant luxuries, glimpsed only at festivals when nobles passed in procession. For such peasants, the idea that colour could be restricted was as strange as the notion of eating off silver plates. Life was hard, and cloth was for warmth, not for vanity. Thus, the colours of forbidden clothing speak to us of a medieval world, where appearances were more than vanity. They were a form of obedience, a thread woven into the structure of power. To wear the wrong shade was not just fashion, but rebellion, a breach in the careful order that held society together. And yet, behind every law, there pulsed a restless yearning, for in the shimmer of scarlet or the glow of purple lay a promise of dignity and beauty that no statute could wholly suppress. In the play of colours upon fabric, one can glimpse both the strictness of medieval order and the timeless human hunger to be seen as more than one station allowed. In the medieval world, the table was not only a place of nourishment, but a stage upon which order, respect, and civility were displayed. Meals, whether humble or grand, carried with them a set of customs that shaped how food was shared, how hands were used, and how voices were raised or restrained. To eat in company was to reveal one's upbringing and one's place in society, for the language of table manners was as binding as the spoken tongue. A man who chewed too greedily, a woman who reached across her neighbour, a guest who dirtied the tablecloth with unwashed hands, all risked being remembered for their breach of conduct rather than their words. In this way, even the simplest act of breaking bread became a moral and social ritual. Before the meal began, there was the washing of hands, a practice not only of cleanliness but of reverence. Servants carried basins of water to the tables of the wealthy, pouring it gently over the fingers of lords and ladies, while towels of linen were offered for drying. Among peasants, the washing might be nothing more than a quick rinse at a bucket by the door, but the act still mattered, for clean hands showed respect to both food and company. Then, prayers were spoken, sometimes brief, sometimes long, and only after words of thanks could the meal begin. The table was thus sanctified, turned into a place where both body and spirit were fed. Yet once eating commenced, rules became more intricate. Bread, that most basic of foods, was to be broken with the hands, never bitten into whole. To tear bread apart with teeth was considered uncouth, animal-like, a mark of greed rather than grace. Soup or broth was sipped quietly from bowls, or from the bread trenchers that held them, and one was cautioned not to slurp or blow too loudly. Meat was cut with a knife, then eaten with fingers, for forks, though known in parts of Europe, were not yet widely used. Thus, hands were ever busy, but the mouth was expected to remain composed, chewing softly, speaking gently, avoiding the crude noises of smacking, burping, or sniffing. The sharing of food was itself a delicate matter. Platters were often communal, placed in the centre of the table, from which each guest took a portion. To reach across rudely was frowned upon. Instead, one waited for dishes to be offered or passed. The best pieces, such as the choicest cuts of meat, were expected to be given to those of higher rank, a gesture of deference that reinforced the hierarchy of the hall. To seize them for oneself was not only rude but rebellious, a small act of defiance against the order of things. Guests were reminded to eat modestly, not to heap their trenchers too high, nor to waste what they had taken. Moderation was praised, gluttony condemned, for to eat in excess was to betray both greed and weakness of spirit. Books of courtesy written in the later Middle Ages reveal the peculiar detail of such manners. They advised against licking fingers too noisily or against scratching at the table. One was warned not to lean too heavily over one's plate, nor to gnaw bones with abandon. Even the smallest gestures were considered revealing. To pick one's teeth with a knife, to spit on the floor, to sniff at food before eating it. Each was a sign of poor breeding. Good manners were not simply niceties. They were social armor, protecting one's reputation and binding communities together through shared rituals of restraint. In noble feasts, the choreography of manners was even more elaborate. Music played softly as servants moved among the guests, filling goblets with wine, replenishing platters with roasted game and fish. Conversation flowed, but always with care, for loudness and interruption were frowned upon. Guests were expected to praise the host, to compliment the dishes, but never to boast of their own affairs. Even laughter had to be measured, lest it appear coarse. And when the final course was served, often fruits, nuts, or sweetmeats, prayers once again closed the meal, and guests rose with solemn dignity rather than haste. In contrast, the tables of peasants were simpler, yet even there, rules prevailed. A father might chastise a child for gulping too quickly, or for wiping greasy hands on clothes instead of cloth. Meals were humble, bread and pottage shared from a single pot, yet respect for the food itself and for the company around it was a lesson taught from youth. The idea that food was sacred, that to waste or dishonor it was to insult both God and labor, underpinned even the humblest of suppers. Imagine then the flicker of candlelight over a long trestle table in a manor hall. Knights and ladies lean gracefully, breaking bread with measured hands, speaking softly, their gestures deliberate. Servants glide in silence, replacing trenchers, pouring wine, removing bones. At the far end of the hall, a minstrel sings, his voice weaving through the murmurs of conversation. Outside, peasants eat by firelight, children dipping bread into a pot, their manners simpler but still guided by the same belief that the act of eating was not only necessity but ritual, a moment that revealed the soul. Thus, the language of table manners in the Middle Ages was both strange and familiar to us. It blended practical advice with moral instruction, transforming eating into a measure of character. To chew too loudly, to grasp too greedily, to waste too carelessly, these were not just lapses in etiquette but signs of deeper flaws. And so each meal became a lesson, each table a classroom, where people learned not only how to sustain the body, but how to live within the ordered, fragile harmony of their world. The Middle Ages was an age of ritual, and among the most solemn of these was the vigil, the long, wakeful night spent in prayer, in silence, in watchfulness beneath the dim glow of candles. To us, the night is a time of rest, but for many in that distant world, it was also a time of discipline, of devotion, of straining body and spirit against the pull of sleep. These vigils were not reserved for monks alone, though the cloistered life cultivated them most faithfully. Knights on the eve of knighthood, pilgrims before a great journey, mourners at the side of the dead all kept nights of watching, their eyes heavy but their will anchored in purpose. In monasteries, the vigil was a regular duty, woven into the rhythm of prayer. At midnight, when most of the village slept beneath layers of straw and wool, the monastery bell called its brethren to rise. Barefoot and weary, they shuffled into the chapel, its stone walls echoing with the soft scuff of sandals, the whisper of robes. Candles flickered before the altar, their flames trembling against cold draughts, and the monks began to chant matins. The darkness outside was vast, the stars wheeling slowly overhead, but within the chapel, the measured cadence of psalms filled the void. To remain awake through these hours was itself an offering, a small crucifixion of the flesh in service of the spirit. Fatigue pressed heavy on eyelids, yet voices rose steadily, a murmur of praise against the silence of night. For knights, the vigil carried a different weight. Before receiving the accolade of knighthood, a young squire was expected to keep a watch through the night in a chapel, armed and kneeling, his sword laid before him. He prayed for strength, for honor, for the courage to bear the duties of his new life. Alone, with only the glow of lamps and the carved faces of saints around him. He wrestled with both fear and expectation. Sleep tugged at him, but to surrender would dishonor his vow. Thus the vigil became a trial of endurance, a test of resolve before dawn brought the laying of spurs and the touch of the sword. Even common people, far from abbeys and castles, knew the vigil as part of life's passages. When death came to a household, neighbors and kin gathered through the night, sitting beside the body of the departed. They kept watch not only out of respect but from a lingering belief that souls lingered, that evil spirits prowled in darkness, seeking to disturb the newly dead. Candles were lit, prayers murmured, stories told, as men and women fought sleep in solidarity with the departed. The night of watching was thus both a farewell and a shield, a way to ensure the soul's safe passage and the household's peace. Pilgrims too embraced vigil, especially before setting out for holy shrines. They gathered in churches, kneeling on cold floors, whispering prayers until morning bells rang. For them, the vigil was both purification and preparation, a stripping away of comfort before the hardships of the road. And in towns and villages, the custom of wake nights blended reverence with community, for not all vigils were solemn silence. Sometimes they included songs, food, and even drink, as people kept each other awake through hours that might otherwise have crushed the spirit with fatigue. The experience of such nights was deeply physical. The body ached, the head nodded, the chill of night crept into limbs, yet the purpose was always higher than comfort. To remain awake was to resist weakness, to demonstrate devotion, to stand watch when others surrendered to dreams. The struggle itself became holy, for in enduring weariness, one imitated Christ in the garden, who urged his disciples to stay awake with him. Failure was common. Many a monk dozed in his stall, many a mourner drifted into slumber, but even these lapses carried no shame, for the attempt was a gesture of love and discipline. Imagine a monastery cloister under a winter sky, the stars blazing cold above, frost glittering on stone, the sound of voices rising in chant from within the chapel. Imagine, too, a knight, alone in a dark church, his sword before him, the flicker of candles casting his shadow long against the walls, or a cottage where neighbors whisper beside the body of a loved one, their eyes heavy, their voices soft, yet their presence unwavering. Across these scenes, the vigil bound people to one another, to faith, to duty, to memory. Thus, the night of watching in the Middle Ages reveals a world where sleep was sometimes surrendered, not by necessity but by choice, as a sacrifice of comfort to the weight of meaning. Whether in prayer, in mourning, or in preparation, the vigil turned darkness into a sacred arena, where weariness was transformed into devotion. It was a reminder that even in the most private struggle against sleep, one might find communion with God, with community, with honor itself, while the stars turned slowly overhead, measuring the hours of wakefulness until dawn. Step into a medieval marketplace at dawn, and you would find not only sacks of grain, wheels of cheese, and baskets of apples, but also a dazzling array of foods that to modern eyes seem strange, even unsettling. The scent of spices floated above stalls, mingled with the heavier odors of raw meat and fish, while vendors cried out their wares, eager to tempt both townsfolk and travelers. Among the ordinary and familiar, the Middle Ages revealed its curious palate: hedgehogs roasted whole, swan pies decorated with the bird's own feathers, pastries filled with marrow, and sauces made from almonds and rosewater. Food was more than sustenance. It was spectacle, novelty, and at times a daring exploration of what the body might endure. The wealthy feasted on dishes crafted not only for taste but for wonder. At banquets, swans were served with their skins reattached, feathers gleaming as though they might take flight again, a marvel of art and appetite. Peacocks too appeared on noble tables, their tails fanned, their flesh roasted but their beauty preserved. These were not everyday meals but performances, where food announced wealth and astonished guests. Almond milk sweetened with sugar and perfumed with cinnamon poured into goblets, while gilded loaves of bread shimmered beneath candlelight. The flavors of distant lands, nutmeg, cloves, saffron, were worth their weight in gold, and to serve them was to show one's reach across oceans and deserts. Yet the market stalls told a different story for common folk. Here one found eels writhing in baskets, cheap and plentiful, ready to be baked into pies or boiled into soups. Frogs, caught from ponds, offered another humble meat, while snails, gathered from gardens, were stewed with garlic and herbs. Hedgehogs, their spines singed away, roasted until their flesh softened, made a curious dish for those who could catch them. The taste for balance, drawn from theories of humours and from contact with the East, led cooks to craft meals that were as much medicine as indulgence. To eat was to restore harmony in the body, and spices were thought to warm or cool the humours, to cure or to guard against illness. For the poor, meat was rare, but ingenuity filled the gaps. Pottage, a thick soup of vegetables, grains, and occasional scraps of meat, simmered endlessly in pots hung over hearths. Into it went whatever the season offered: beans, cabbages, roots, nettles. Bread, dark and coarse, soaked up the broth, while small luxuries like a pinch of parsley or a clove of garlic brought bursts of flavour. Cheese, often strong and pungent, preserved milk's richness through the year, and in lean times even bark acorns or ground chestnuts might find their way into bread, stretching flour through hunger's press. To eat in such a world was to weave survival and invention into every meal. Festivals transformed the market into theatres of abundance. On feast days, pigs were roasted whole, their skins glazed and gleaming. Mince pies bulged with dried fruits and spices, while jellies dyed red or green quivered on platters. The sight alone was as nourishing as the food itself, for it spoke of triumph over scarcity, of joy in community. Children stared wide-eyed at candied almonds, while jugglers and minstrels mingled among stalls. In such moments, food became a celebration of life, a brief defiance of hunger's shadow. Still, not all odd foods were for celebration. Hunger drove people toward the unexpected. In years of famine, when fields failed, grass and weeds were boiled into bitter soups, bark was scraped from trees, and rodents were trapped and roasted. Chronicles tell of desperate winters when even cats and dogs found their way to the pot. These were not delicacies but grim necessities, reminders of how fragile survival could be. Against such hardships, the oddities of feasts, the swan pies, the gilded loaves seemed like visions from another world, glimpsed only from the outside. Imagine, then, the bustle of a market square, women haggling for fresh fish, boys darting among stalls, a merchant proudly displaying a sack of saffron brought from the East, its weight worth a year's labour. A noble steward selects spices and sweetmeats for an upcoming feast, while a peasant woman buys coarse rye bread and a handful of onions. At one table, a hedgehog roasts. It smells sharp and unusual, while at another, almond milk is poured into clay jugs, fragrant with cinnamon. The sounds of barter, the calls of vendors, the lowing of animals all blend into a chorus of life, sustained and defined by food both strange and familiar. Thus, the market of odd foods reveals the wide spectrum of medieval taste and necessity, from the extravagant tables of nobles to the humble pots of peasants, from roasted swan to nettle soup. The diet of the Middle Ages was a mirror of its world, harsh yet inventive, constrained yet curious, always finding ways to transform what the earth and trade provided. In every roasted hedgehog, every gilded pie, every pot of humble pottage, we glimpse a society where food was not only survival but story, written daily upon the tongue. In the quiet rhythm of medieval life, even the simplest gesture, a hand extended, a loaf torn, a blessing traced, carried layers of meaning, and among these gestures, none was more fraught than the use of the left hand. To us, left-handedness may seem a quirk of nature, a harmless variation, but in the Middle Ages it was shadowed with suspicion, fear, and stigma. The left hand was linked with darkness, with awkwardness, with sin. To favour it openly was to mark oneself as different, even dangerous, for the world was shaped quite literally for the right. Language itself revealed the prejudice. The Latin word sinister meant left, but also came to signify ill-omened, unlucky, evil. In contrast, the word dexter, meaning right, gave us dexterity, skill, righteousness. From sermons to everyday speech, this duality seeped into thought. The right hand was the hand of blessing, the hand of order, while the left was the hand of misfortune. When priests raised their arms to give absolution, it was the right hand that traced the cross. When knights swore oaths, they placed their right hands upon sacred relics. To offer the left was to invite doubt about one's sincerity, even about one's soul. Children who showed signs of favoring their left hand were often corrected, sometimes harshly. A teacher might rap their knuckles. A parent might bind the left hand behind their back, forcing the child to labor with the right. Such training was not cruelty in their eyes, but correction, a steering of the child away from paths of shame or suspicion. To allow a child to grow left-handed was to risk marking them as odd, as ungodly, even as possessed. For in the medieval imagination, difference was often dangerous, and conformity was a shield against fear. The left hand was also tied to cleanliness, or rather, to its lack. In daily life, the right hand was reserved for honorable tasks, eating, greeting, blessing, while the left hand was associated with what was unclean, with bodily functions, with work thought unfit for the right. This division reinforced the taboo, making left-handedness not just unnatural but indecent. To reach for food with the left hand, especially at a shared table, was to insult one's companions, a breach of manners that carried moral weight. Even in combat, the left hand was mistrusted. Knights trained with swords in the right, shields in the left, their formations designed for uniformity. A left-handed fighter disrupted the order, his movements unexpected, his stance reversed. Such men were sometimes admired for their unpredictability, but more often they were treated as curiosities, outliers who did not fit the rhythm of the drill. In tournaments and battles, the left-handed knight might find his advantage, but he also risked suspicion from comrades who saw his difference as unnatural. Yet superstition reached deeper still. To dream of the left hand was said to portend misfortune. To see a bird fly to one's left was an omen of ill luck. Witches and sorcerers were believed to favor the left in their rituals, turning circles against the sun, calling upon powers that walked contrary to order. Even the devil was imagined as left-handed, his gifts offered with the wrong hand, his bargains sealed with gestures that inverted the sacred. Thus, to be left-handed was not only to be awkward, but to be shadowed by whispers of the occult. And yet, as always, the truth was more complex. Some who could not be forced to change quietly carried their left-handedness through life, learning to disguise it in public while relying on it in private. A peasant hoeing in the fields might switch hands when no one watched. A child scolded for writing with the left might practice secretly by candlelight, hiding their skill. These small acts of persistence remind us that, even in an age of conformity, individuality found its way, though often at a cost. Imagine a classroom in a monastery school, rows of boys hunched over tablets, scratching letters with styluses. A boy at the end of the bench grips his stylus in his left hand, his movements smooth and natural. The master notices, frowns, and strikes the desk with a rod, commanding the boy to switch. The child obeys, but his script becomes shaky, his letters crooked. Behind him, whispers stir among classmates, some mocking, others merely curious. The stigma takes root, not only in the boy's hand but in his heart, teaching him that difference carries shame. So too at the Lord's feast. A servant weary hands a goblet with the left hand, and the hall erupts in murmurs. Though small, the gesture unsettles, for in it guests see disorder, impropriety. The servant blushes, corrects himself, but the stain of the moment lingers. Such was the weight of the left hand in that age that even an innocent act could echo with suspicion. Thus, the fear of the left hand in the Middle Ages reveals how deeply culture can shape perception, turning a natural trait into a mark of unease. It tells of a world where order was prized above all, where conformity guarded against chaos, and where even the smallest difference could be cast as sinister. Yet within that fear, we glimpse the resilience of those who quietly bore their left-handedness, navigating suspicion while continuing, in their own way, to live and labor in a world that mistrusted their touch. In the dim glow of a medieval chamber, where parchment was dear and secrets often more dangerous than swords, men and women sometimes turned to invisible ink. The methods were as curious as they were practical, simple household liquids, unremarkable to the eye, that vanished once dried but revealed their words when coaxed by flame or light. Among these strange substances, none was more common or more startling to us than urine. What was usually cast aside as waste became, in careful hands, a tool for secrecy, carrying messages across kingdoms, monasteries, and courts, its scent hidden, its power unsuspected. Urine was not chosen merely out of whimsy. The knowledge that certain juices, whether from lemon, onion, milk, or human water, could leave faint, unseen traces, was passed quietly among scribes, merchants, and spies. To write with urine, one dipped a quill into the pale liquid, scrawling words that faded as the parchment dried. To the naked eye, the page seemed blank, as innocent as any scrap of parchment awaiting its first stroke. But hold it close to a candle's flame, or press it with heated iron, and the letters would darken, rising out of emptiness like ghosts. The secret would appear, a message hidden in plain sight, safe from casual eyes. Such invisible writing had many uses. In monasteries, where correspondence passed between abbots or brothers of distant cloisters, discreet words could be hidden from prying eyes, warnings of heresy, hints of disobedience, pleas for aid. Among merchants, invisible ink carried instructions to partners abroad, notes on prices or smuggling, concealed within harmless letters of greeting. But it was in courts and councils, where politics brewed, that the art of hidden writing found its sharpest edge. Courtiers whispered, spies listened, kings plotted, yet on parchment, nothing but empty space seemed to speak. Only when warmed would the hidden hand be revealed. Urine, for all its oddity, was far from the only medium. Onion juice, milk, vinegar, and lemon all served, their traces invisible until warmed. Recipes varied. Some advised mixing urine with alum, others with vinegar, to sharpen the letter's reappearance. Some used the liquid of crushed herbs, their faint acid searing words into parchment only when coaxed. But urine remained abundant, always near at hand, requiring no costly trade, no precious spice. In that simplicity lay its value, a resource as humble as it was effective. One can imagine a scribe at his desk, quill in hand, dipping not into ink but into a small earthenware pot. He writes swiftly, the strokes faint, the parchment drying pale. To the casual observer, he is merely preparing fresh pages, but he knows the words lie hidden, waiting for the flame. Later, a trusted courier tucks the letter into his satchel, riding across muddy roads and through guarded gates. When it reaches its reader, the parchment is held near a candle. Slowly, as heat kisses the surface, the ghost of writing emerges, words of warning, perhaps, or names of allies and foes. In the flicker of firelight, secrets come alive. To use such ink was not without risk. If intercepted, the blank parchment might be dismissed as harmless, but if suspicion fell, and if the trick was known, a captor might reveal its words with heat. In such cases, the very substance meant to conceal could condemn. Spies were unmasked, conspiracies laid bare, and sometimes lives were ended because of invisible ink betrayed by careless hands. Thus the art of hidden writing was wrapped not only in ingenuity but in peril, a delicate balance between secrecy and exposure. Yet there was wonder too in the practice. For those who saw it the first time, the sudden birth of words from blankness seemed magical, alchemical. To see a page ignite with meaning, as heat swept across it, was to glimpse the hidden powers of the natural world, where even the most humble fluids held mysteries. Children in noble households sometimes delighted in the trick, scribbling secret messages revealed by the kitchen fire. But for the serious, for monks, merchants, and kings, it was a tool of great consequence, a way to speak silently across distance and time. The strangeness of urine as ink reminds us of the resourcefulness of medieval life, where nothing was too common, too base, to be repurposed for need. In an age without printing presses, without swift couriers or sealed envelopes, secrecy demanded invention. And so, in dim chambers and by candle flames, words were written in fluids that bore the weight of both ridicule and salvation. They carried treachery, devotion, and commerce alike, hidden in the fibers of parchment until the moment came to draw them out. Thus the letters written with urine speak to us not only of oddity but of the constant human desire to conceal and reveal, to guard truths until the right eyes see them. In every faint stroke, invisible until flame gave it voice, lay both ingenuity and danger, a reminder that in the Middle Ages, even waste could become a vessel of secrets, whispering messages across a world that watched, suspected, and feared. In the medieval world, where clocks were scarce and time itself seemed to flow with the rhythm of sun and season, life was measured less by minutes than by the ringing of bells and the cadence of prayer. The monasteries, spread across the countryside, like anchors of order, kept the hours with unwavering devotion. Their days were divided not into morning, noon, and evening, but into matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and complin 8, sacred intervals when voices rose to heaven, binding time itself to devotion. For monks, every task, from baking bread to tilling fields, was fitted between prayers, as though the world outside existed only in the spaces carved out by worship. The toll of the bell was the heartbeat of this rhythm. At dawn, when the first pale light crept over cloisters, the bell summoned the community to lauds. At midday, when the sun hung high, sext called them again. Even at midnight, when darkness lay deep upon stone walls, matins roused them from fragile sleep to chant psalms in flickering candlelight. The passage of hours was not marked by the movement of shadows alone, but by the lifting of voices, the chanting of scripture, the repetition of ritual that ordered not just the monastery, but the very sense of time itself. Outside the cloisters, the same rhythm spilled into villages and towns. The parish church bell rang out across fields, telling peasants when to begin work, when to rest, when to gather for mass. Farmers knew the hours not by clocks but by the echo of sound carried on the wind. At the bell's call, they paused to cross themselves, to murmur a quick prayer, to remember their place within a greater order. Even in marketplaces, where the noise of barter and trade filled the air, the bell's toll could still hush voices, bending commerce for a moment toward reverence. The prayers themselves were more than ritual, they were markers of light, of season, of life itself. Prime marked the freshness of morning, when the day's work began. Sext fell when the sun was at its height, a pause that mirrored Christ's suffering on the cross. None arrived in the late afternoon, its name recalling the 9th hour of the Passion, while Vespers bathed the evening in song as light faded into twilight. Finally, Compline closed the day in quiet humility, preparing body and soul for the coming dark. Each prayer tethered the present moment to memory and meaning, so that no hour passed without significance. Even for those who lived far from cloisters, the habit of prayer marked the flow of days. Housewives whispered psalms as they kneaded dough. Shepherds sang hymns beneath the open sky. Travellers paused at roadside shrines to lift their thoughts heavenward before pressing on. Time was not simply endured, it was sanctified, each interval set apart by words that bound heaven and earth together. In this way, medieval life was steeped in a sense of continuity, a daily weaving of the sacred into the ordinary. The soundscape of a medieval town was therefore filled with bells, each one tied to devotion. The Angelus bell, rung at dawn and dusk, reminded the faithful of the Annunciation, while great feast days were announced with long peals that rolled across the countryside. These bells were the voices of time itself, their tolling not only guiding work and worship, but binding communities into a shared rhythm. A peasant at his plough, a monk in his cell, a noble at his table all heard the same sound, all bent their heads at the same call. But the devotion was not without strain. Monks often struggled against fatigue, roused from sleep for matins, their bodies aching, their eyes heavy. Yet endurance itself was considered holy, a sacrifice of rest offered to God. Villagers, too, sometimes grumbled when the bell interrupted work, but still they paused, for to ignore the sound was to risk both social scorn and spiritual peril. The rhythm of prayer was thus both comfort and command, shaping life with invisible hands that touched every household. Picture a monastery at dawn, the cold air sharp, the sky faintly grey. The bell sounds, deep and solemn, echoing across stone courtyards. Monks rise silently, forming a procession to the chapel, their voices rising in chant as candles flicker against carved walls. Far beyond, in fields dotted with mist, a farmer straightens his back, hearing the same bell on the wind. He wipes sweat from his brow, crosses himself, and whispers a prayer before guiding his oxen once more. Different lives, yet tethered by the same sound, the same rhythm of prayer that divides the day. Thus, the medieval measure of time, by prayer, reminds us of a world where the sacred was woven into every hour. Time was not an empty vessel to be filled with labor or leisure, but a living cycle of devotion, punctuated by bells and voices. Each day was a liturgy, each hour a reminder of God's presence, each moment sanctified by ritual. To measure life in prayers was to give it shape and meaning, to transform the ordinary flow of hours into a sacred journey. And though the bells have long fallen silent in many places, their echoes still linger, a faint memory of a time when the turning of the day was guided not by clocks, but by the ceaseless call to lift one's heart heavenward. When one steps into the cloisters of a medieval monastery, what strikes the soul is not only the smell of incense, the cold stone walls, or the flicker of candles, but the presence of silence. For silence was not emptiness here, it was discipline, prayer, and life itself. The monks who gave their days to God were bound not only by chants and labor, but by long stretches of wordless stillness, where every spoken sound was weighed with care. In such silence, the rhythm of existence slowed, each breath deliberate, each step echoing like a bell against the cloister arches. The rule of St. Benedict, followed across Christendom, enjoined monks to curb the tongue. Words, it was believed, led easily to sin, to gossip, to pride, to anger. Silence guarded the heart against temptation and kept the mind fixed upon God. In the dormitories, monks lay side by side on straw pallets, whispering nothing, their prayers spoken inwardly. At meals, they ate in silence too, broken only by the voice of a reader reciting scripture or the lives of saints from a lectern. The clatter of spoons against trenchers, the creak of benches, these small sounds became their language, a kind of music of necessity. For those who lived in this discipline, silence was not loneliness, but communion. To sit in the cloister garden beneath a sky spangled with stars, saying nothing while one's brother weeded the herbs nearby, was to dwell together in harmony deeper than words could grant. The silence was not empty but full of prayer, of memory, of the rustling wind in the orchard trees. Monks learned to read one another without speech, to sense need by gesture, to share companionship in a glance. In a world beyond, where markets roared and taverns rang with laughter, the monastery became an island of quiet, a haven where silence itself was sacred. Yet silence was not always easy. Novices struggled most, for the human urge to speak, to laugh, to tell stories, pressed against their vows. Many a young monk felt the weight of unshed words burning in his throat, the longing to share a memory or a jest. The discipline was harsh, but purposeful, for through silence they were taught humility, patience, and endurance. Those who broke it too freely might be given penance, hours of prayer, extra labor, or the sting of rebuke. In this way, silence shaped the soul, smoothing pride into submission, forging obedience through restraint. But silence was not absolute. The chanting of the divine office filled the chapel day and night, voices rising and falling in measured harmony. In these moments, the monk's silence broke, not into chaos, but into music, words given back to God in unison. Afterward, quiet returned, more profound for having been lifted. Silence and sound, denial and offering, wove together into a rhythm that defined monastic life. Imagine the refectory at midday, long tables lined with monks, heads bowed over bowls of pottage, no word spoken. Only the steady voice of the reader echoes through the hall, recounting the trials of martyrs. Outside, the bell tolls softly, reminding the world beyond that prayer continues. Or picture the cloister walk at night. Candles flicker in niches, the moon casts pale light, and a procession of monks passes in silence, their sandals soft against stone. In that stillness, time itself feels altered, as though eternity leans close. The silence of monasteries extended its influence beyond their walls. Travelers spoke in awe of it, finding both peace and unease in the stillness. Kings sought counsel from abbots who had lived years in such discipline, believing their words carried greater weight for having been so carefully hoarded. And even villagers near abbeys felt the pull of silence, pausing as they heard the faint chanting carried on the wind, reminded that somewhere close, men lived in stillness for the sake of the whole world. Thus the weight of silence in monasteries reveals not emptiness but fullness, not absence but presence. It was a silence that spoke louder than words, teaching humility, shaping souls, and weaving time itself into prayer. In that quiet, monks discovered both their weakness and their strength, learning to live not by the noise of markets and courts, but by the deep, steady rhythm of hearts turned always toward God. Though the medieval year was often heavy with labour, hardship, and the silence of discipline, it was also brightened by moments when all that strictness yielded to joy, the festivals that marked the calendar with colour, music, and merriment. These celebrations, woven into the cycles of harvest, saints' days, and holy seasons, gave peasants and nobles alike the chance to step outside the ordinary. Fields might still need tending, the mills still turning, but for a day, work was set aside, and the village square or castle court became a stage of laughter and ritual, where the whole community danced together. Festivals carried many forms, from the solemnity of Easter and Christmas to the playful excess of Carnival before Lent. The Church, ever watchful, framed these events with liturgy and prayer, yet the people filled them with revelry that spilled beyond chapels and processions. May Day brought garlands of flowers, bonfires, and the raising of the maypole, around which men and women wound ribbons in bright spirals. Harvest festivals brimmed with gratitude, tables heavy with food, ale flowing freely, music filling the night. Carnival, that riotous farewell to meat before fasting began, saw masks, costumes, and jesters mocking authority and laughter that bordered on rebellion. The dance itself was the heart of these gatherings. In village squares, fiddlers, pipers, and drummers struck up tunes, and men and women joined hands in circles, lines, and steps that repeated with hypnotic rhythm. The dances were less about display than about unity. Everyone could join, from the youngest child to the oldest elder. To dance was to participate in community itself, to embody joy in motion. The music, simple but infectious, echoed long into the night, and for a time, burdens lifted, and the world felt light. Festivals were also feasts for the senses. Markets overflowed with roasted meats, honey cakes, and spiced wine, scents mingling in the air with the smoke of bonfires. Jugglers and minstrels roamed the crowds, their tricks and tales delighting children. Masks and costumes transformed the familiar into the strange, neighbours disguised as kings or beasts, their laughter unrecognizable behind painted faces. In some towns, mock battles or tournaments entertained the throng, while in others, plays were performed, telling stories of saints or of fools, blending sacred with comic in ways only festivals permitted. Yet beneath the merriment lay meaning. Festivals marked the turning of the year, anchoring people to the rhythms of season and faith. They reminded peasants that winter's hunger would give way to spring, that toil was not endless, that joy too was part of the order of things. They allowed nobles to display their wealth in banquets, clothing, and games, reinforcing their place in society even as they shared in the dance. And they gave the church opportunity to teach, to remind people through pageants and sermons that behind the laughter stood deeper truths of sacrifice and salvation. Still, festivals could unsettle authority. In the carnival's topsy-turvy spirit, servants mocked masters, fools paraded as kings, and women sang bawdy songs that would never be heard in the churchyard. For a day, the world turned upside down, rules bent by merriment, and though the order of society returned with the dawn, some unease lingered. Authorities tolerated this release, knowing that laughter and inversion kept deeper unrest at bay, but always they watched carefully, ensuring joy did not turn to rebellion. Picture a medieval village on May Day. Garlands of green drape over doorways, young men climb trees to cut boughs for decoration, children chase one another through meadows. In the square, a tall maypole rises, ribbons fluttering, while musicians tune fiddles and pipes. As the sun warms the earth, the dance begins, circles spinning, feet stamping, voices raised in song. The air smells of roasted meats and blossoms. Laughter rings, and for a moment, the harshness of daily life fades, replaced by a harmony of movement and sound. Such was the dance of festivals, a rhythm of relief, of joy, of community. It gave people not only escape but renewal, a reminder that life was more than toil, more than hunger, more than silence. In the turning of seasons, in the steps of the dance, they found both celebration and hope, weaving merriment into the fabric of their year. The festivals, strange and vibrant, reveal to us a medieval world not only burdened with hardship, but alive with laughter, music, and the shared joy of being human together beneath the turning sky. In the dim chambers of the Middle Ages, where candles burned low and silence stretched deep into the night, dreams carried a weight far beyond idle fancy. To sleep was not merely to rest the body, but to enter a realm where vision spoke of fate, of warning, of divine or demonic influence. The people of that age did not dismiss dreams as chance. They believed them to be messages, sometimes sacred, sometimes sinister, etched into the mind by forces unseen. Thus, each night was a crossing into mystery, and each morning, waking eyes searched memory for clues of what had passed while the soul wandered. Dream books, copied and recopied by scribes, circulated among scholars, nobles, and even merchants. These manuals promised to interpret symbols, offering guidance for those troubled by visions. To dream of water, one book declared, foretold change; of fire, danger; of birds, news to come. To dream of teeth falling was an omen of death, while to see gold gleaming was a promise of fortune. Though many of these texts drew from ancient sources, Greek, Roman, even Arabic, they became woven into medieval life, mingling with Christian thought. Priests sometimes cautioned against them, warning that dreams might be the devil's trickery, yet even they could not deny that the Bible itself spoke of visions in the night. Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, Daniel reading the visions of kings. Such stories gave legitimacy to the belief that sleep revealed truths. Yet fear clung to dreams as tightly as hope. Nightmares, with their grotesque images and crushing terrors, were thought to be assaults by demons, riding upon the sleeper's chest, stealing breath, sowing fear. The figure of the night hag haunted villages, a spirit believed to sit upon a sleeper, leaving them paralyzed and gasping in dread. Parents taught prayers to children before bed, charms whispered to guard against such visitations. Herbs, too, were placed near pillows, sage, lavender, or rosemary thought to ward off evil and encourage gentle visions. Even the simple act of making the sign of the cross before sleep was a shield, for the night was never fully safe. Some visions were thought to be prophetic. Chronicles tell of kings who dreamed of battles before they were fought, of peasants who dreamed of storms before the harvest was lost. Whether true or embroidered in memory, these tales gave dreams authority, making them a currency of foresight. A noble might summon interpreters to read his vision, seeking advice before choosing war or peace. A widow might ponder a dream of her husband, wondering if his soul lingered, seeking prayer. Dreams became conversations between the earthly and the divine, though the speaker was often uncertain. And yet, not all dreams were lofty. Some were woven into daily life, shaped by hunger, by cold, by fear. A peasant who fell asleep after a day of toil might dream of bread, of meat, of warmth, visions born of want more than prophecy. To him, the dream was still powerful, a reminder of longing unmet, a whisper of what the heart most desired. In contrast, the well-fed noble, surrounded by furs, might dream of hunting stags or feasting in halls, his visions as extravagant as his life. Dreams thus mirrored the world of the dreamer, yet still they were treated as omens, for in every vision lay possibility. Imagine a monk in his cell, waking before dawn, troubled by a dream of a stormy sea. He rises, kneels upon the cold floor, and prays, believing the vision to be a warning of trial ahead. In the same hour, a woman in a village stirs from sleep, having dreamed of her dead child smiling at her. She weeps softly, torn between comfort and sorrow, unsure if the dream is blessing or grief renewed. Across the land, countless others wake with fragments of visions, puzzling over their meanings. whispering them to spouses, neighbors, confessors. Dreams were not private fancies but shared concerns, stories told in daylight, weighed for truth. The superstition of dreams reminds us of a world where the boundaries between waking and sleeping were thinner, where night was never simply rest but a passage into mystery. To the medieval mind, dreams could not be dismissed. They carried weight as omens, as warnings, as whispers from beyond. In them, people found both fear and hope, both danger and promise. And though centuries have passed, one can still hear the echo of that belief. For who among us has not woken from a dream, heart racing, wondering if it spoke some hidden truth? For them, that wonder was not fleeting, it was a part of life itself, a nightly communion with the unseen. In the Middle Ages, when clocks were rare curiosities and the passage of minutes meant little to most, it was the bell that ruled the rhythm of life. Its sound carried across fields, valleys, and streets, cutting through wind and chatter alike, a voice of iron that told people when to labor, when to pray, when to rest. The toll of bells shaped both sacred and ordinary time, weaving the divine into the daily, reminding every ear peasant, monk, noble that life was ordered, structured, and fleeting. Each village church had its bell, often the largest and most precious possession of the parish. Forged with care, blessed in ceremony, and hung high in towers, these bells were more than tools of sound. They were guardians, protectors, voices of the community. When they rang for prayer, the field stilled, hands lifted in blessing, and lips murmured familiar words. At dawn, a gentle toll welcomed the day. At dusk, the Angelus bell called for evening prayer. On feast days, their jubilant peals rolled far and wide, while in times of mourning, their heavy, slow strikes spread sorrow through the land. Monasteries carried this rhythm further still. Their bells rang 8 times a day, dividing the hours into sacred offices, matins in the night, lauds at dawn, prime with morning's light, then terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline. Each sound summoned monks to the chapel, breaking the silence of fields and scriptoriums with a call that none could ignore. For them, the bell was not only a timekeeper, but the very heartbeat of their devotion, binding their bodies to prayer as firmly as their souls were bound to God. Even sleep was governed by its toll, interrupted at midnight to rise and chant psalms, their voices answering the bell's command. But bells spoke not only of prayer, they marked danger too. When fire broke out in a village, the frantic toll rang sharp and fast, summoning neighbors to fight flames with buckets of water and frantic hands. When enemies approached, the bell clanged in warning, sending men to arms and women and children to safety. In pestilence, its voice mourned continually, ringing for the dead carried to shallow graves, its sound so constant in plague years that people grew numb to it, hearing only sorrow in its iron tongue. Bells thus carried both comfort and fear, weaving together joy and tragedy in their sound. For the common people, who owned no clock and measured days by the sun's course, bells were a tether to order. They reminded farmers when to leave fields, bakers when to set ovens, and market folk when to open and close their stalls. The toll structured life without precision, for bells marked broad hours, not fleeting minutes, but that was enough. To them, time did not race, it breathed, guided by seasons, by light, and by the bell's call. Imagine a small village at dawn, mist rising from the fields, roosters crowing, and then, suddenly, the bell. Its voice rolls across the valley, deep and steady, calling people from sleep. A farmer rises, pulls on rough wool, and leads his oxen to the plough. A mother stirs the fire, whispering prayers as she kneads dough. Children rub their eyes, hearing the sound that tells them the day has begun. Hours later, at noon, the bell tolls again, and workers pause, lifting heads, crossing themselves, murmuring thanks. At dusk, another call, and families gather inside, shutters closed, lives bound once more to rhythm. The toll of bells was not mechanical precision, but it was binding, unifying. Its sound reached everyone alike, noble and serf, learned and unlearned, reminding them all of the passing of time, of the fragility of life, of the order that lay above their labor. It was both command and comfort, demanding obedience yet offering stability. and in its deep tones, people heard not only the measure of their days but the echo of eternity, a voice that would long outlast their own. Thus, the toll of bells and time reveals how the medieval world shaped life, not with clocks and schedules, but with sound. Each strike of iron against bronze was a reminder, a summons, a warning, a celebration. Time was not silent, it rang, and in its ringing, communities found their rhythm, their safety, and their faith. To live in the Middle Ages was to live always in the shadow of bells, their voices guiding hearts and hands from dawn to dusk, from birth to death, from earth to heaven. When the day's labour ended and the bells had fallen silent, medieval life slipped into a darkness deeper than we can easily imagine. For in a world without lamplight on every corner, without the hum of machines or the glow of glass screens, night was vast, enveloping, and full of both fear and mystery. To sleep in such a world was never simple rest. It was surrender to a realm where danger lingered and spirits stirred, where the body yielded but the soul remained wary. Night carried shadows not only of the physical world but of belief, superstition, and custom, shaping how people lay down their heads and drifted into dreams. Most homes glowed only faintly once the hearth fire had been banked, and families gathered close upon their pallets of straw or wool. In cottages, parents, children, and even livestock shared the same space, their warmth warding off the cold. Candles were costly and burned sparingly. Once the flame was snuffed, darkness pressed heavy, broken only by moonlight slipping through cracks in shutters or the pale shimmer of stars through thatch. To venture outdoors was to step into a realm owned by owls, wolves, and spirits of the imagination. People believed night belonged to forces beyond human control, witches who flew, demons who whispered, restless souls who wandered. To sleep, therefore, required both trust and ritual. Prayers before bed were as essential as blankets. "Now I lay me down to sleep" was not just a sentiment but a ward against unseen danger, for death in sleep was common, sudden, and feared. Charms were sometimes hung above beds, crosses carved from wood, sprigs of protective herbs, or relics of saints. Parents traced blessings over children, whispering words to shield them from nightmares, and the night hag said to sit upon sleepers, pressing the breath from their lungs. In villages, stories passed of men who woke with scratches, swearing spirits had ridden them in the dark. Fear and faith mingled in the act of closing one's eyes. Sleep itself did not come in one unbroken stretch as it does for many today. Historians tell of the first sleep and second sleep, a pattern in which people slept for several hours, then woke in the middle of the night, stirring for prayer, for quiet talk, or even to visit neighbours before returning to bed until dawn. This segmented rest mirrored the medieval view of time as fluid, punctuated not by hours of the clock but by bells, prayers, and the natural rhythm of body and season. The night was not a void but a living interval, divided like the day, structured by custom. In monasteries, sleep was shorter still, broken by vigils and prayers. Monks rose at midnight to chant psalms, returning to bed only briefly before dawn. Their rest was deliberate deprivation, a sacrifice of comfort to sharpen the soul. In contrast, peasants clung to every scrap of sleep they could find, their bodies weary from toil, yet even they often stirred between sleeps, whispering prayers, tending fires, or reflecting quietly in the stillness. Night was a time of vulnerability, but also of intimacy, of whispered conversations between spouses, of mothers rocking children, of solitary thoughts unshared by daylight. Dreams, too, filled the night with meaning. As earlier told, they were taken as omens, as visions sent by God or disturbed by the devil. To wake from a vivid dream in the middle of the watch between first and second sleep was to wonder what message it carried. Was it a warning of illness, of betrayal, of death to come, or was it simply the echo of hunger, of memory, of fear? People rose in the dark to ponder such questions, their thoughts mingling with the shadows around them. Imagine a cottage on a winter night. The fire has been banked low, glowing faintly red beneath its cover of ash. Parents lie upon a straw mattress, children curled beside them, their breaths slow and warm in the cold air. A pig shifts in the corner, chickens rustle upon their perch. Outside, snow falls silently, muffling the world. In the darkness, one child stirs, whispering of a dream, and the mother soothes him with a prayer. Hours later, the father wakes too, slipping from bed to stoke the fire, murmuring his own brief prayer before returning to his rest. This was the medieval night, not silent, not empty, but a tapestry of breaths, murmurs, rustlings, and dreams. Thus, the shadows of night and sleep reveal the heart of medieval life, a world shaped by darkness, by fear, by faith, yet also by resilience. Sleep was never just slumber, it was a passage into mystery, divided by prayer, guarded by charms, deepened by the presence of family and beasts alike. In the heavy dark, people laid down their heads not knowing what dreams or dangers the night might bring, but trusting that dawn and the toll of bells would return to order their lives once more. Night was both an ending and a beginning, both peril and peace, the shadowed counterpart to the day's toil, and in surrendering to it, the people of the Middle Ages revealed their deepest truths, that life was fragile, faith essential, and rest like light, like food, like time itself, a gift never taken for granted.